Let me show you how I turn this blank wall into a beautiful fireplace with built-ins. First, I had to find the studs in the wall, and this is probably the most important part because you definitely don't want the fireplace falling on you. And the first thing that I did was frame the fireplace. So I cut what's called ledger boards, and then I drilled those into the studs, and these will hold the structure of the fireplace to the wall. I added 3 separate boards to make sure the whole fireplace structure is nice and sturdy. Then it was time to frame the fireplace, and I'm using all 2x4s for this. It's super inexpensive to frame a fireplace. I started with the 2 sides first, and I really love using SPAX screws with something like this because I don't need to pre-drill. It just goes right through that 2x4, super easy. I made sure everything was level because I am going to put drywall on this, and then I attached it to the ledger board with some 3-inch screws. When you hear that awful drilling noise, you know that it's going to be nice and sturdy. Then it was time to frame out the section for the fireplace insert. And I do say insert, this is just an electric fireplace. So it's rated to sit between a 2x4 and studs, so there's no worry about any fires happening. I also made sure to place the studs on the top of the fireplace 16 inches apart because I will be installing a TV. Moment of truth, I was definitely nervous with this part, and these things are so heavy, so I definitely got my workout in. Once I got the front framing in place, I then screwed the sides of the fireplace framing into the front. Yes, I'm a weirdo, but I had to test it out and make sure it was sturdy. Then it was time for drywall, which is probably the bane of my existence, but it was so difficult to do. I know that I completely put the drywall the wrong way. I did it vertically when you're really supposed to do it horizontally, but honestly, it was just super easy for me to do it this way. So that's how I did it. And then I cut the fireplace out with a oscillating tool. Made it really easy. You can also use a router for this, but I really didn't want to use a router because it makes so much dust, and there was already a ton of drywall dust everywhere. Now let's speed this up because you get the gist. Zzz. After getting all the drywall in place, I used a spray adhesive to attach the corners to make the ends of the drywall more finished. I definitely suggest wearing a mask with this. It definitely got up my nose and maybe in my lungs. So probably not a good place to have those. So definitely wear a mask if you're going to be using this. After my headache went away from the glue smell, I then used joint compound to hide all those little drywall holes. And then I attempted to cover the seam for the drywall with tape. I didn't do the best job. I am not a drywall tape pro. I definitely needed to use a lot more joint compound than I did, but it worked out in the end. I just had to do a bunch of layers until the whole thing was nice and smooth. Let me tell you, I did hours and hours worth of sanding, but if there's anything that you need to invest in when you're doing any type of sanding, please get a sander that attaches to a vacuum, because sanding it inside makes it so easy. Then it was time to frame either side of the fireplace for the drywall, which will hold the cabinets. I was honestly just wigging this part, which is probably half of my projects, but you definitely learn as you go. And I just wanted to make sure everything was nice and sturdy, because I definitely don't want my parents to be mad at me if everything falls down. I made sure everything was attached to the studs in the back wall and then the fireplace on the side. So the whole structure was screwed together. So again, nice and sturdy. And yes, I had to check it out for myself. And then we did more drywall, which I was absolutely hating, as previously discussed, but it will be worth it for the end result. Then I taped all the seams with drywall compound. I even did those inside corners where the cabinet's gonna go. I really didn't have to do it, but I just wanted to make sure that I did everything properly. Then I primed the drywall. I used Dutch Boy primer because it's really nice and thick, and I like a nice and thick primer to hide all those holes from the joint compound. Probably my favorite part of the entire build was actually making the fireplace surround. I used white oak, which is by far my favorite wood. I just love the grain. It's just so pretty. I used pocket holes to make the frame that will rest on, again, another ledger board that will hold up the fireplace surround. Perfect fit. Then I made the two sides of the fireplace surround, again with pocket holes. It just makes it really easy to put everything together. I used white oak for the front and then plywood for the back, so I wasn't wasting all that white oak because you won't see the back of the fireplace surround. Then I put the top and the sides together to form the fireplace surround. And you can see each piece is basically like a box that rests on these ledger boards. I will say the most important part of this step is making sure everything's level and plumb, or the whole thing just will not sit properly. But it ended up being a perfect fit the first time, which almost never happens to me, but it did this time, so hallelujah. Then it was time to make the outer part of the fireplace. And again, I used strips of white oak, and then I rounded over the edge to give it a little bit more of a mid-century modern vibe, because that's what my parents were going for. To attach the fireplace to the ledger board, I just screwed in from the top and it made it so it can't move. Then I just nailed in those accent pieces to the side and the front. For the top, I wanted to round over the edges, and a little can actually works perfectly for this, and I just cut it out with a jigsaw and then sanded it and rounded over the whole thing. I just used tiny little nails to attach the top, and then I added some extra trim around the top and the side. In this instance, hindsight's definitely 2020, but I really, really wish I would have painted before I made the surround. But sometimes I get so involved in a project that I have to do the woodworking part first because I'm so nervous I'm not gonna be able to do it, and then do the painting part next, which I already know I'm gonna be able to do. Anyway, it worked out, but I highly suggest you paint before you do anything else. We settled on this super dark gray so that we could contrast the white oak a little bit more. And I like a moody dark color. I don't know about you, but I think it really makes wood pop. I will say when you're painting with a dark color to go really light on the paint, because I had to do this a couple of times because the natural light came in and you could definitely see the streaks. So go very light when you're rolling it on. Then I cut all the plywood for the cabinets. I'm using birch plywood for this because it's really nice and smooth. So it looks great on the interior of cabinets. And then I just glued and screwed everything from the outside, since you're not going to be able to see the side of the cabinet. That's what's great about built-ins, is you can just use screws and you really can't see anything. But just make sure everything is nice and square. I added 2 boards on the top of each base cabinet, and this will hold up the wood countertop. Since this was at my parents' house, my daughters had to come with me pretty much every day that I did this, but it was great because they love helping out. Then I cut out the pieces for the upper cabinets. I had to do all of this in my parents' garage on the ground. Luckily, I had a track saw. It made it so much easier to carry it around with me. Again, I just glued and screwed everything from the sides because they won't be visible. My mom even helped out.
This picture light, rechargeable. Yeah, baby.
And it was a perfect fit. If you can't tell, I was super excited. I had never done anything like this before, so I was a little nervous to have it fit in between 2 walls, but luckily it worked out. To make the countertops for each side, I had to make a template out of some scrap plywood that I have, and I just used some CA glue, which is a really fast setting glue, and the spray to make it so that I can scribe each countertop to size so that it fits perfectly between all 3 sides of the wall. After I traced the template onto the white oak countertop, I cut it to size with my track saw to ensure a perfect fit. Then I attached all the face frames with some glue and a pin nailer. I actually just got the pin nailer for just this project, and then I returned it because actually I don't really love this pin nailer that much. It had some issues firing, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this one, but a pin nailer is great if you don't really want to show the nails. Then it was time to attach the doors. I always use my Craig jig hinge jig for this. Then you just clamp it down and drill it. It has a stop collar on it, so you can't drill past that. So it makes it perfect for hinges every single time. Since these doors are so tall and so heavy, they're made out of solid white oak, I opted for 3 hinges. This will stabilize it a little bit more. I like these hinges because you can adjust them. I will list them in the description. And since these are inset doors, I had to add a stop on the inside so that when they're closed, they will stay closed and not go any further into the cabinet. The moment of truth, after tons of sanding, making sure everything was nice and smooth, I applied one of my favorite finishes to white oak, which is Rubio Monocoat Natural. I love this stuff because you literally only need one coat. So you apply it, it's the stain and it's finish all in one, and then you're done. Honestly, I was most nervous to drill the holes for the handle because I worked so hard on these white oak doors, and my mom picked the longest poles imaginable. I think they were appliance poles, so I had to make my own jig to be able to drill the holes correctly. I was so nervous. I just used a scrap piece of plywood and made sure it was nice and square. And then I added a top edge and a side edge to it. And you'll see in a minute, but these will rest against the top and the side of the cabinet, referencing it to make sure that the poles are nice and straight when I drill the holes. Instead of drilling right through the holes into the door, I used a hole punch to be able to see exactly where the holes were at and make sure that I liked the positioning. I probably took the jig on and off several times to make sure I had the positioning correct, but it did work out and the poles looked amazing. I am definitely happy she went with the long ones. Although I was extremely nervous, it looks great. Then I had to figure out how to tile around the fireplace around. And the tile that my mom picked again was a little hard to work with. It's this really thin mother of pearl tile, and I just could not get a straight edge. So I figured it out, and I took a piece of plywood and used painter's tape to create a straight edge, and then ran it through the tile saw, and hallelujah, it freaking worked. I was so happy because I had done a million test cuts and it just did not work. I'm sure this will probably upset some people, but I used Muscle Bound, which is a tile mat. It's a really, really sticky tile mat that you just press down onto the drywall. It works extremely well to hold the tile in before you grout. That way you can just grout the same day. Honestly, it's amazing stuff. A lot of people say not to use this around a fireplace, but I decided to use it because the electric fireplace does not get hot around the fireplace. So it's not going to have any issues in the future. I use these little tile spacers in between each sheet of tile. It took me a little bit of time to do, but the end result will be worth it. I will say, out of this entire project, I absolutely hate tiling and grouting. It's just not as much fun as the woodworking part, but that's just me. Then I grouted, make sure to get all the grout into those little teeny spaces. And then I like to do little sections at a time so that it doesn't dry hazy, because when it dries hazy, it's really hard to get that extra grout off the tile. Then I use a special tiling caulk to seal around the edges with the wood. Because wood moves, you're going to want a caulk instead of using a grout so that the caulk can move with the wood with the seasons and it's not going to crack. Then it was time for the finishing touches. I added the baseboard. And although I was reluctant to add crown molding, I did it and finally figured it out, because let me tell you how many cuts I went through to actually get it correct. I had to go back to the store multiple times to get more crown molding. So I probably wasted a little bit of money, but again, it's worth it. Then I finished off with 2 coats of that dark gray paint.
Big thing for you, John, is this feeling that food is going to waste. I mean, we haven't even used a full.
And I added these really easy to install battery powered picture lights from Shades of Light, and it really made the entire thing come together. So we were going for a little bit of a mid-century modern vibe while still keeping it nice and classic. How do you think it turned out? I absolutely love it. It took about 4 months, but again, well worth it.